Welcome to AASHTO Resource Q&A. We're taking time to discuss construction materials testing and inspection with people in the know. From exploring testing problems and solutions to laboratory best practices and quality management, we're covering topics important to you. Now, here's our host, Brian Johnson.
Welcome to AASHTO Resource Q&A. I'm Brian Johnson.
And I'm Kim Swanson, and we have another one of those PSP Insight episodes that I know I love so much.
We do, and our special guests today are John Molesky. He is the manager of the Proficiency Sample Program. John Molesky, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian and Kim. Glad to be here for another exciting discussion about soil.
Next, we have Ryan LeQuay. Ryan has a position that I can never remember the title of.
I'm the laboratory and testing manager for the Proficiency Sample Program.
And then we've got Joe Williams, senior quality analyst for the AASHTO accreditation program. Joe, welcome.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
I am excited about this topic, even though I don't know what we're actually going to talk about. I always love these PSP Insight episodes because I learned so much, because even though I've been a part of AASHTO for over 10 years, I still don't know really what's all happening on the technical end. So I always learn stuff in these kind of episodes.
We'll see what we can do about that. John, let's start with the soil classification and compaction sample. This is one of our larger samples that we send out. Can you talk about how we prepare this particular sample before we get into what happened with the results?
So this year was pretty typical blend of material. Start out with a crushed limestone this year. So it's not that we've never used it before, but it seems to work well and gives us a good homogeneous sample. And then we blended that material with I believe it was a 20 mesh clay. If I'm correct, I'd have to go back and double check on it. Try to vary the size of the clay specifically to adjust the values for hydrometer. Between a 30 mesh clay or 20 mesh or 200 mesh, it allows us to kind of change the sedimentation of that product. But other than that, pretty standard material for us.
I didn't realize that. So when you order the soil, you can actually order the particle size by particle size of the clay?
That's correct. I believe that the supplier that we select has, I think, 7 or 8 different clays that we can choose from. And those clays vary in particle size based off of the milling process that they use. But we can get it anywhere from like a number 10 mesh all the way to a 200 mesh. So we could, basically 100% of the clay could be passing the 200, and we could also get it so it's 100% passing the 10. Obviously, the gradation varies in between, but we can change it up, and it's one of the techniques we use to help adjust the samples a little bit as it relates to gradation and sedimentation.
Just out of curiosity, and maybe you don't know the answer to this one, what are the applications for that particular material?
The materials that we specifically found that work well, especially when it comes to blending and homogeneity and stability, are used in refractory products or refractory operations.
So it'd be bricks.
So bricks, any kind of molds or casts, anything like that, seems to work out very well for us when it comes to blending and processing the product.
Okay, that's interesting. So I learned something new, Kim. You're not the only one who learns things in these.
John, what goes into the thought process of if you're going to add more of this or less of that?
So when I go through the design process, I run some of the tests that a laboratory would use for or when they're participating. I'll take a look at things like hydrometer, liquid limit, plastic limit, Proctor, and just kind of play around. And it's one thing to look at the numbers, but it's another thing to also look at consistency. If I'm running a liquid limit that, unless I really put a high amount of clay in it, it seems to act more non-plastic, has a lot of a gritty texture to it, I might back off on the sand and add a little bit more clay just to make sure that we have some plasticity in it. I also like to try to vary maximum density, based off Proctor. So basically look at the numbers and change it around. But one of the other things and I know this is going to sound so like elementary, but how mushy it is, like how squishy is it going to package well? And another thing is how dusty is the material when we blend it. I'm sure everyone who listens to this podcast remembers the red stuff we sent out. I think it was 2 years ago or a year ago.
It's last year because it's all on my shirt right now.
There you go. Yeah.
I'm back there doing 1 year samples. So
Ryan's got the 1 year stabilities going on right now, and that red clay blend that we used was very, very high when it came to respirable dust. So we did our best to contain it. Probably going to eliminate it, but that is also a factor: how it blends, how it looks, how dusty it is. So we try to worry about many different aspects, not just the material properties and how they're going to relate to PSP and what the data is going to look like. But like I said, there's just some weird things that we got to worry about.
So how many like small little test batches do you do before you determine like this is it, let's do this in bulk for everybody?
So I usually vary the proportions of sand and clay. I might start out with something like just easy 50-50, 50% clay, 50% sand. Run a couple of tests, then I'll adjust it, 45, 55, 40, 60, mess around with it. Sometimes if I'm feeling a little excited, I'll go and throw some bentonite in it to try to, increase the water content for liquid limit. So it just all depends on what we do. But like I said, we usually try to keep it within like a 10 to 15% range. And then when we do the design, actually go for it, the samples need to be reasonably close. So usually the percentages are within 5 to 10% of one another. We won't go too far beyond that, just to make sure that we're staying reasonably close to each other.
Thanks for the insight on that. I never knew. And again, I've worked with you for a long time, and I don't think I've ever thought to ask that question. So thank you.
And sometimes it works out easier than other times. This one, going off his data, you tried 4 different blends before you hit the one you liked.
A lot of trial and error. I know that trial and error has been a hallmark of the proficiency sample program forever, because you always try to mix it up, and your predecessor would also try to come up with some interesting blends that would be not the same thing every time, because once you get too boring in what you're providing, it becomes very predictable what the results should be in the samples. So that's good. I know some people, skeptics or critics would say, you're trying to trick them, but it's just trying to make sure that we're still evaluating fairly instead of just giving somebody an easy answer every time. Let me ask you another question about these soil samples. I don't know if you're going to want to talk about this, but I know that the international shipping can be difficult for soil because of the implications of agricultural concerns, even though we're not sending agricultural soil, we're sending processed, refined materials that are meant for construction. But how has that been going these days as far as getting soil shipped all over the world? Are we having any success getting it through where it needs to go?
It depends on the country. It's very, very specific. We were struggling a little bit with Guam. That was kind of a little bit of a hurdle for us. And actually, Hawaii was also a bit of a challenge. I ended up getting into contact with some of the people at the Department of Agriculture in those respective locations. And once we explained what it wasn't for any kind of commercial use. It was for testing purposes, and how it's been treated prior to leaving our facility. They've been okay with it. So it's cleared there without a problem. Our biggest hurdle right now has been Saudi Arabia. We are struggling like crazy to get not only the soil samples, but basically any sample through customs, through Saudi Arabia. It's just been a super challenging effort. We are working with FedEx almost on a weekly basis at this point to try to get those samples to the participants, just working on different clearance for codes and customs, if there's any kind of permitting. The tough part for us is we've done some heavy investigation into permitting it from our end to get it through customs. And the sample fees would have to go up probably fourfold for us to even make it feasible to get the product there. So that would, a fourfold increase in the fees would not even generate us revenue. That would be a break even for those participants and for us. So it's almost getting to the point where we're having those discussions about suspending service to Saudi Arabia and some of those other countries that we're running into major challenges. And the tough part is, the Saudis make up about 40% of our international business across the board. So it's challenging. We don't want to see that happen. They use our products. We know they like it. We get a lot of positive feedback from that part of the world. But unfortunately, it's getting so challenging for us. They're not, getting the service that they're asking for. So it's been tough lately, specifically with soil and Saudi and the mixtures. I think, Ryan, what do we probably had 70% of the mixture samples, the asphalt mixture samples, come back recently just because of the samples not clearing customs.
Yep.
And the other thing is too, Saudi is very specific. They have a non-destroy clause when it comes to shipment. Other countries will simply just throw the sample out and burn it, get rid of it, however possible. But Saudi Arabia has a no destroy clause in their protocol. So they will export it back to us at our expense. So that makes it challenging. We just ship the sample, paid for it to get there, and then we have to pay for it to get back, and the lab still didn't get it anyway. So it's just not really a good system right now, and it's not working out very well for us. So we're having discussions internally about how to handle things internationally moving forward.
Well, that's really complicated. Hopefully, the rest of the discussion goes a little bit easier. So let's talk about the data, which should be more complicated, but maybe I should reserve judgment. John, what did we see this time with the soil samples? So we're talking about 187 and 189 as the sample pair for the soil classification and compaction sample. What was interesting in the data, if anything? What kind of trends or what's the top level analysis from that sample round?
Pretty typical, Brian. Seeing a lot of similarities between previous rounds with the standard deviations. It was good to see that we had some consistency there. We're starting to get some more data coming out of the 7928, the hydrometer, that newer version of the hydrometer, and able to make some comparisons and draw some similarities and differences between T88 and D422. So that's been good to see. We're getting, like I said, getting some more information there. Once again, just another typical PSP. Had a little bit of variation in liquid and plastic limit, which was good. Same thing with the Proctors. We had a little bit of variation compared to, I shouldn't say variation as in material variation, but variation as in average values. So it was good. Starting to also get more data here for soil resistivity and pH. The sulfate and chloride ion contents are a bit challenging. Those have come up a little bit different than we anticipated. They have a very high coefficient of variation. So the standard deviation is almost the same as the average. It's almost 100%. So at this point, it's a little bit tricky. There's something going on there that we got to figure out. We may have to go and try to do some work on the back end. Ryan and I might have to look at figuring out a way to make a subsample for those and do some spiking to get the chloride and sulfate ion contents higher. But that's stuff that we have to play around with in the future. It's something that obviously we can't go back and change now, but we're gonna have to look to make some improvements overall. But once again, pretty typical round for us. The 1S values are very consistent from year to year, so that's what we would like to see.
Ryan, what do you think about the chloride ion content results?
Whenever you look at those two samples compared to everything else, there's definitely a much larger standard deviation. It's newer methods to us, something we haven't dealt with as long. So going back to our catchphrase of trial and error, we'll figure it out. It just might take us a few rounds.
Did you think that there are some potential improvements in the test method that could improve the overall performance?
Great question, Brian. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. We'll definitely look into it.
So Joe handles the proficiency sample rules for accreditation, and he also handles a lot of the review of the sample rounds to see if there are any unusual results from an accreditation perspective. But I know we were talking the other day and noticed that there was a lack of participation in a few of the tests. How's that looking now, Joe?
Participation in those pH and corrosion tests is definitely going up. Definitely a lot of labs are catching on that they do need to submit data for those if they're accredited for those, or they're dropping those tests if they don't want to maintain that accreditation. I think it's good to really quick summarize how we handle suspensions from PSP issues, just so everybody can keep in mind that it actually takes 2 years or two sample rounds for a suspension to take place. It's 2 rounds of ratings of 0 or 1 on a single line item, or data not being submitted for a test, or a combination for both. So this sample round, we had 144 suspensions that we need to process, that QAs need to process, and that's about 10% of the accredited labs that are enrolled in the soil classification program. The interesting part of that is that 124 of those 144 labs, the suspension is caused in some part due to data not being submitted. So I think as far as participation goes, that's something to really keep in mind, that in most cases, if you participate and you submit data as you're supposed to for your accredited tests, you'll probably be okay.
Especially with those standard deviations that John was just talking about.
Yeah, with those ion contents, I did take a look really quick, and we only had one suspension for T290, and that was because data was not being submitted. So no labs were submitted for missing on those high standard deviations. So
some good insight. So you remember, you got to play to win. Make sure you submit that data if you're accredited for a test, or you really are putting yourself at a disadvantage in risk potential suspension just for lack of participation. Let's talk about the hydrometer. We did get some questions about why we continue to offer the old hydrometer test, which would be T88 and D422, and the new hydrometer, which is a combination of a lengthy procedure for the gradation coupled with a lengthy procedure for the hydrometer on the finer particles. And I cannot off the top of my head remember the ASTM test designations for those. Kim, can you help me out there?
7928, Brian.
Thanks, Kim. So 7928. And what's the gradation part?
6913.
6913. Thank you. Thank you.
Kim's voice just changes all the time.
Yeah, she's got a little bit of a frog in her throat today.
I do. Thank you for noticing. I apologize for that. There we go.
We are working it out.
6913 is not included in the program, though. It's just hydrometer. It's just 7928.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I thought
Yes.
we were including. Okay, all right,
No.
my mistake. Okay, so let's talk about that. How did the two compare this time? Are we seeing tighter standard deviations on the new hydrometer? Are we seeing different results between the two, like significantly different? Well, I shouldn't say significantly, because that opens up a whole statistical significance conversation that we don't need to have. But are we seeing any larger changes between the results than expected? John?
Taking a look at some of the standard deviations for D7928, they appear to be pretty consistent. The 1S value has been right around 0.002 for the, I guess this is the particle diameter at 4 minutes of sedimentation. So we're seeing a lot of consistency across the board. This is just one example that I've cited here. When I go and look at the bigger picture in comparison to some of the values from the former 422 or T88 and seeing how that compares to D7928, there's actually quite a bit of overlap. When I take the data and I just do an overlay on the two different test methods, I see quite a bit of consistency. One thing I specifically targeted when I did some evaluation this time was looking at the particle diameter for 422 at the 0.001 millimeter and compared that to the D7928 particle diameter that was closest to 0.001, and that came out to be 0.0012. The standard deviation of those were right around the same. It was about 3%. There was over 60% of overlap in the data. So 60% of the time, a laboratory could have submitted the same data and got satisfactory ratings, which is pretty interesting to see how similar those two tests are as the data turns out, even though they're completely separate test methods.
You want to see the overlap? No?
I'm not sure.
Okay,
I would say it this way, Kim. I would anticipate that the data would be similar because you're still using a hydrometer, right? All of that stuff with Stokes' law and sedimentation, it should be similar if the material is similar. It's just that the prep and procedure for 7928 is drastically different than D422.
I mean, I think you'd want to see from the standards perspective, you make all these improvements because you want to see a tighter tolerance. You want to see more repeatable results. And I think the other concept that we had talked about in one of the other episodes when we've actually dug into this topic is through better methodologies for prep, you should come up with a more true result of what that gradation or particle size analysis should be. And I know that was a big sticking point for switching to the newer standard. So those are the kind of things we'd want to look for, but it's hard to tell, okay, which one is more correct, especially when you're looking at our proficiency samples. But I don't know how you could really determine that because the test result is what determines the trueness, right? So I guess it depends if you feel that it's a scientifically sound methodology or not. Ryan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I actually just made a note to myself. This is something we could dive into once we have time and energy. We have the data. We can look at it over the years, see how well it's improving, see how well they compare to each other. So it's a rabbit hole to go down at some point.
Just took a quick peek here to try to, ballpark the 1S values for that 0.001 millimeter particle diameter size. And they're very consistent between the two test methods. They're right around 3%, give or take, based off the material that we sent. But they appear to be fairly consistent, which, like I said, that's what you would expect if you're following a similar methodology, when it comes to sedimentation in a cylinder.
And we dive into this transition from ASTM D422 to D6913 and D7928. Could you tell I was reading those? Yes, you could. In season 1, episode 24 of the podcast, if you want to go and get some background on that from a few years ago, I'll put a link in the show notes as well.
This could go to Brian and Joe as well, but I was under the impression that one of the major reasons why we haven't moved away from D422 is simply due to specification. Is it still a major player in the industry?
Definitely. We still have a lot of laboratories accredited for D422, several hundred. And the other issue is T88 is still a valid test method that is published by AASHTO, which is the equivalent of D422. So I think as long as those two are still being used, then we'll still offer that in our program.
I was going to say the same thing. That's with any ASTM standard, even if it's allowed to sort of sunset, or they use the phrase come off the books, that just means it's not being maintained anymore. It's not being actively revised or kept up to date anymore, but the standard is still available on the ASTM website. Agencies can still specify it. So just because it's not being actively maintained anymore, a lot of laboratories still want to be accredited for it, are running it, and being asked to run it.
For those listening, I would like you to guess how many laboratories are currently either accredited or suspended for ASTM D422 right now, the old hydrometer. Let's go around the horn. Ryan, you already looked it up, didn't you?
That was what I had my hand raised for.
Oh.
So
Okay, we'll skip you.
Yep.
Kim.
I'm going to say 500.
Okay. All right, Joe.
Well, the only thing I looked at was the number of labs participating in D422, and it was about 1,000 and change. So I'm going to say 700.
All right, I'll allow that. John?
Kind of did the same thing Joe did. I looked at the number of labs who submitted data, and it was around 1,000. I'm gonna go a little more specific here. I'm gonna just guess, and I'm gonna say 849.
All right. I would like the record to show that I just blindly picked a number. You guys actually did some research, and I have no clue. So I just want to throw that to the listeners that I just guessed. So just there we go.
I'd like to bid $1, Brian.
No, but Price is Right rules do apply here. So our winner is Joe Williams because the number is actually 815 laboratories.
So close.
John was closer, but he overshot it. I should have laid out the rules before we guessed, though. But I think just in general around our office, the Price is Right rules do apply when we're guessing numbers. I don't know why that is, but we do.
At least
That's not how we do our. That's not how we do our proficiency sample ratings.
I was
so I
just
don't
like,
want people to get confused by that.
how
You-
often are we just guessing numbers as a staff? Like, this is not terribly common, but maybe I'm just not in the right departments.
We
More
do
than
it
you
in app a
think.
good bit with
We
these same
do.
kind of situations. With these same kind of situations, how many labs are in this situation or accredited for this test? We'll let everybody take a guess.
Yeah, it is typically stuff like that. So I don't want anybody to think that we're making accreditation decisions based on methodologies used by game shows. We don't do that. It's just if we're having some kind of trivial discussion. So hopefully people were interested in finding out that many laboratories are still accredited for it. Because I think some people think that the use of that standard is really kind of falling out of fashion, and it really isn't.
Well, I had a question about that. Do you think that they are still being accredited for it and seeking accreditation for that standard just because they've always had, or do you think it is actually because they're working on projects that are requiring that?
They're working on projects that are requiring it. I know I've heard, and I don't know if this has changed recently, but last I heard the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is still recognizing D422. And that is a massive specifier in the United States. So there are a lot of laboratories that do that kind of work, and it's important for them to maintain accreditation for that test method. So unless that changes, I don't see this number falling out anytime soon. And I know that there were some people that thought that our charge was to facilitate the changeover to the new method, and that is not what we do here. So we kind of see what people are using, and then we respond accordingly, but we're not trying to drive that change because we don't frankly know if that is the change that needs to happen. Only the specifying agencies would know that. Joe?
Yeah, just to kind of go back to a topic we talked about a second ago on the same topic. John, is there any conversation or request to include 6913 in the PSP program? Which is the partner to 7928, the coarse particle gradation?
I have not had any personal discussion with anybody who wants it. I'm not sure if any of the feedback that we have solicited through the sample rounds that our quality manager collects has indicated that we should consider adding it. If I do remember, though, Ryan, I think you and I had some discussion with some industry folks about this, and what we ended up talking about was that we would have to actually add aggregate materials in with the sample. We would have to go beyond +4 to ensure that we were getting a reasonable gradation for 6913, and that would have been a struggle. It would have caused homogeneity issues with the material and product, and also production time, if I remember.
Yeah, pretty much the best approach to it would have been having it be its own sample. We wouldn't be able to just lump it in with soil.
Speaking of its own soil, one thing that we may have to consider, especially for those the corrosivity methods and the pH and resistivity, that may be one thing where we have to break out into its own specific scope at some point. Looking at the data from previous rounds, the past few where we've had it, how we were talking about the coefficient of variation being almost equivalent to the standard deviation, that doesn't add a lot of value. So that might be something where we need to split out those samples and do a little bit more on our end, add some material to spike it to actually get reasonable values that people can measure. And that'll allow us to take a deeper look into the standards themselves and see if we could make any improvements.
Yeah, there have been some other soil samples people have been interested in, particularly geotechnical testing samples. Before we get into R value and CBR, I wanted to ask you about whether or not there's been any movement on that. I know some people were thinking about sending out either loose material that can be compacted or maybe some Shelby tube specimens that have been prepared, but I think that would be challenging. But where are we on that one, John?
We're doing our best to work on it when we can. It's a struggle. Ryan had mentioned it. When we get the time and the opportunity, we try to take it to learn a little bit more. We spend some time actually working with our other resource staff members who help facilitate and run our geotechnical course that we have that's been virtual and at AASHTO Resource on site. They've all essentially reconstituted samples or prepared samples in-house from materials that we had laying around from PSP. So they've gotten a chance to kind of play around with it a little bit more. We're looking into using some of that methodology along with some of the other industry recommendations, such as the under compaction effort or method, and just trying to figure out a way to do it. But the hard part is trying to figure out a way to do it on a mass scale. If I remember correctly, we have almost 500 laboratories accredited for the various geotechnical tests. So if you look at basic methods like consol, shear, UU, and CU, you have to prepare basically one specimen for each one of those tests. You do that in duplicate, and that is a lot of time standing next to some sort of retrofit compression device that you're applying a certain amount of soil to for so many seconds. So there is a lot that we have to research and continue to evaluate before we do this. But at some point we are going to launch a program. It just probably won't be for a few years yet.
I've got one more thing on the soil. This is actually a question I got from a QA earlier today. This is about test standard D4972. That's pH testing of soils. I was asked if the lab had to submit data for either the pH value in water or the pH value in calcium chloride, or both, or how we were doing that. This is the third sample round that we've had this test. The first one actually only had one entry for pH value, but we've since then split them out. It is required that the laboratory submit data for both. 4972 in the scope mentions that the measurements in both liquids are necessary to fully define the soil's pH. And then the reporting section of that standard also indicates that they need to report the pH values in both liquids. So just a point of clarification there, that laboratories accredited for that test need to be submitting data for both.
Anything you want to say, John, about that change from previous rounds to this round?
Just that it was a recommendation from the industry. We had some laboratories contact us, and they basically said, "Hey, why did you do that?" And we said, "Well, we originally just had it in water to try to keep it as simple as possible." And then they pointed us to the standards that it's actually extremely important for you to get the pH in this slurry. So please add it. So we did. We take things like that into consideration all the time, especially with the data sheet comments and feedback. Yeah, I want to point out one of the other changes that we made this year for soil resistivity. We actually specified the moisture content that should be used when you're preparing your specimen to put in the box. And that actually appeared to have dropped the standard deviation by about half. So rather than laboratories determining on their own what a saturated specimen looks like, we just simply said, okay, 20% when we were playing around in the lab doing our design work, that 20% moisture looks like it's pretty saturated. So let's go ahead and use that. And it looked like it made a difference. I'm not going to 100% commit to it yet because we need to see what a few more rounds look like. But that may be something that could be viable for a standard revision in the future if we see that we've greatly improved the precision of a standard by simply specifying a moisture content. So kudos to all of the labs who are submitting feedback and letting us know what's going on, and hopefully we can make some changes that are meaningful.
Ryan, why don't you give us some insight into why that is the case?
Anytime you can control a variable, it brings in that accuracy. We're making that target just that little bit tighter. While it might not be the situation they're dealing with, for our situation, any part we can control, we're going to have better results from.
Yeah, I thought you were going to get into electrons and
No, I don't think we have time for that.
All right, we'll move on then. Let's talk about some rounds that we've had for a really long time, and people have been hammering out these CBRs forever, right? And we've got not great results typically as far as the coefficient of variation historically has been. How are the CBR results looking these days?
More of the same, pretty much. If these were samples that you're running, in your own lab, on your own projects, your CBR at 0.2 inches is greater than your CBR at 0.1 inches, so you'd be rerunning this. But for us, we're just looking for the results. That's all.
Well, how's the repeatability looking though? How did the labs perform? What's the spread look like?
We got a 1S of about 9 with the results of 26 and 31. Not great.
A lot of room for satisfactory ratings in there, which is good. So Joe, Probably not a whole lot of suspensions related to CBR, I assume.
No, this round we only had 10 total suspensions for CBR. And again, 6 of those 10 in some part were related to data not being submitted. So get your results in.
That's right. If there's one takeaway from this episode, I think it is that you have to get your sample results in. It is a requirement of the program to be accredited. You do have to participate in the assessment program and you have to participate in the proficiency sample program. It's used as a tool for improving the quality of your testing, of course, but you can't do that unless you submit the data.
So you're trying to say even if you think you have quote unquote bad results, still submit the data?
Yeah, that's what I was almost saying, but I
Okay.
stopped
You
short
stopped
of
saying
saying
it?
that.
Right.
Okay.
But
Well,
thank you
submit,
for correcting it.
if it seems like something you're concerned about is your machine malfunctioning or something like way off base, the big one we get is we never see this type of material out here. It's weird. These aren't numbers I see normally. But we've had people call like, hey, we had to call in external calibration service providers to come in and redo our machines because we thought we were wrong. They weren't. It was just they weren't the results they were expecting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that would be a good tip to have people check before they go through that process.
Right. If it's something extreme, it's better to at least ask first, or at minimum, submit it, note it to yourself. Hey, we had concerns about this, and there's your corrective action.
Okay, sounds good. Let's move on to R value. Are we seeing a decrease in the participation levels for R value?
I say we had about 135 this year. How's that trending, John?
I'm going to go look right now, but if I had to guess, knowing what I know, it's been pretty consistent, plus or minus 2 or 3 labs each year. So it's been fairly stagnant for a very, very long time.
127, 131, 132. Yeah, 120s to 130s.
For some perspective for our listeners, the soil classification sample had just about 2,000 participants in it, where you're talking about the R value has 130-ish. And how many does the CBR have, since I don't think we talked about that?
CBR is around 550 to 600. So there are quite a few more labs in CBR who still do it. But the one thing that really limits us with CBR is the potential for us to have material that actually swells. That's one of the things that's super tricky for us to try to manage. I kind of mentioned earlier that we may do something like blend some bentonite in the material to try to get it to swell. It doesn't seem to work very well. We checked homogeneity, still get reasonable numbers, but it's just something that it's almost like it just, when it's natural base underneath the ground that you're pulling the product from, it works out and you can see some swell or some expansive material, but it's really tricky for us to get it to blend in properly, and it doesn't seem to swell as you would see something like that in real world experience.
So with R value, we're looking for what properties?
For R value, all that we collect is the moisture content as received and the R value at 300 psi exudation pressure.
That's it. 2 parameters.
Okay. I don't have much on R value.
There were no R value suspensions.
We have fewer participants in the R value than the other soil samples we've talked about today. Is that because it's just not popular with specifiers, or is it that the data can be found other places? So I'm just curious of why we would have less participation.
I'm not very familiar with how it's specified, who specifies it. It's one of those tests that I'm not super duper familiar with.
We have no labs accredited for it east of the Mississippi.
Right now, there are 122 laboratories accredited or suspended for R value. They are in Arizona, 1 in Arkansas. Most of them are in California. There's some Colorados, Hawaii, Idaho, Minnesota, Montana, Nevada, and New Mexico. So not a whole lot of states still doing the R value. Some of them are DOTs, and I wonder why they're doing them if there are no, some of those like Arkansas, there are no private labs in Arkansas that are accredited for performing that test though. So I wonder if that is just a remnant of an old specification that is hanging around there. So I'd be curious to see if that changes over time, and it sounds like it's hanging in there for now until maybe a more high-tech test takes its place, maybe with a smaller footprint. That R value test can be quite large. The equipment can be quite large if you talk about the R value device that is used. And then there's, of course, the rack of the different swell specimens, the molds with the apparatus on it. I don't know what the technical term is for that.
I'm going to take your word for it, Brian, because I have no idea what you're talking about. So I'll just take your word that that's a lot of equipment.
It's a lot. And when you see something that's got that big of a footprint, you wonder how long that's going to be viable when there are other new technologies coming out that might be a better way to get data. But I don't know. Somebody must be happy with it because they're still doing it. So who am I to judge?
What's also fun is that the T190 was technically revised last year. So they're still working on it.
That is an interesting item. I was not aware of that. So I think we've covered these soil samples pretty well. Any last thoughts on the proficiency samples, John?
I'm pretty much done.
Yeah,
nope.
John, we've exhausted John. John
I'm
is
done.
slumped
I'm
over
out.
in his chair right now.
Yeah, it's a struggle here.
Ryan, you doing all right?
Yeah, I've got one more proctor left before I can say goodbye to that red soil, hopefully forever.
That's good, and then we'll get you a new shirt.
Oh, that's actually a good point, Ryan. You bring that up, that the red material will no longer be shipped ever. Because we
Never
deemed it.
say never.
I'm
man.
saying ever, man, because we've deemed it to be too unsafe for us to process.
As long as we are in control of it, we will not be ordering it or shipping it.
Correct.
Is that right? Too unsafe?
Yeah, because of the respirable dust. It's super high. And we cannot prepare it in a safe manner for our staff. So we're gonna nix it.
How long have we been using that sample, that type?
So we've been rotating it in about every 4 to 5 years.
Okay.
So we don't do it often, but
we do pair it with dust collectors and respirators on, but it's more hassle than it's worth. Yeah, we're not being unsafe here.
I was gonna say safety is such an important part of the proficiency sample program. It would have surprised me, but I know that of course, if there was a safety concern, like it sounds like there could be, we would take action to eliminate it where possible, right? Isn't that on the hierarchy?
I was just going to say, isn't this an administrative control here?
As the safety manager, I'm so proud of all of you right now because yes, elimination or substitution is really what we want to do. Look, so you guys do pay attention to all those safety meetings that I run.
We do.
I mean, it's going to get in eventually.
It could be that we've been here so long that it's just absorbed into our brains. But I want to thank you all for your time today. I learned a bunch of new stuff. Hopefully our listeners did too.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks for listening to AASHTO Resource Q&A. If you'd like to be a guest or just submit a question, send us an email at podcast@ashtoresource.org or call Brian at 240-436-4820. For other news and related content, check out AASHTO Resource's social media accounts or go to ashtoresource.org.